it's a bit of a weird one, I suppose, because I kind of consider fiction to be existential, in of itself. If we are a storytelling species, which we clearly are, then by definition, all fiction is existential. Where I draw the line is that existential fiction can kind of make you realize more often than not the absurdity of your existence, but also the kind of cold reality, I suppose. And though it is quite often depressing, and a lot of the books in this list certainly are that way, I think it can also provide a kind of melancholic comfort, or a bittersweet ennui, maybe. I might be, you know, throwing out paradoxical phrases here, but in a sense, that is also what existential fiction is kind of like. And I do also think, just to add on, that they stay with you longer than most other literature. Not always, but they kind of just like, there's a place for them inside you, and they can be transformative, most certainly. But they can also be looked back on and reread during different eras of your life, and it's interesting because it's almost like you go back to the person you once was, reading it again, and then seeing how your opinion of it changes. And again, I do think obviously with other literature you can still do this, but there's a quality to existential fiction that kind of, I don't know, it opens some sort of gateway into that in an easier fashion. I mean, that's how I define it anyway. If you define it a different way, let me know. There are some honourable mentions as well, because obviously I had to leave a few out. And of course, there's probably some that I just haven't read. So if you have any recommendations, drop them down below as well, please. Maybe I can return to this at some point. But we're starting with Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the co-founders of the existentialism movement, if you want to call it that, although they didn't label it that at the time, and I actually think they rebuked it. But, people being how they are, it kind of stuck, so it's difficult not to have this guy on the list. The reason it's so high up, I don't think it's the most accessible type of novel. It's not something you pick up and just, get addicted to and whiz through. It's quite slow. It's plotless. So I found, like, the first time I read it, I was kind of searching for the story a little bit. But the second time I read it, which was a few years ago, I actually enjoyed it a lot more. I kind of felt that weight of expectation for a plot obviously gone, and I could actually appreciate it for what it was. And it's told in an epistle format, I believe. I think it's kind of like a diary entry kind of thing. And we follow Antoine Raquintin, and he's a kind of writer of sorts. I think he's like a researcher, and he's just going about in his day-to-day, meeting random people. An autodidact, I think pops up frequently. I think he has a lover as well, but they're just in a kind of like friends with benefits type thing, I think, something like that. But there's not really any sexy scenes or anything like that, if memory serves. But there is an odd relationship to the body within it. So it's like there's often scenes where he's talking about like his mouth and the fleshiness of it and the oddity of that. So he's kind of at that stage, and I can't remember if he is actually this age, but there's a reason there's this 27 club where people, perish. Because I think it's a kind of milestone era, because your youth is behind you and you kind of have a little bit of a existential crisis, surprise, surprise. But yeah, it's, I think he's in and of that age at least. And I do think there's definitely something to that theory. I don't know why, maybe just because I experienced it myself as well. But it could be from anywhere between, say, 26 up until 30, maybe even 33-ish, around that kind of era. It's a bit of a tough one to get through as well, I would say, because it's almost like everything you thought you knew is then confronted by the reality of the world, and it often will make that completely capitulate, and you kind of have to rebuild it from there. And I do feel like Requinton is in that state. Not sure if he actually gets out of it because he's too much of a drifter. But yeah, due to its somewhat, not sure how I would really define it, but I don't want to say it's like unenjoyable, because it is enjoyable, but it's weighty, I suppose. I mean, I did also hear once that Sartre was reportedly to write 30 pages a day during his career. I don't know for how long, but that's pretty crazy. But that also gives me an idea that maybe this was just his kind of notes, and he put them together one day and just kind of loosely wove it into a plot, because that kind of feels like how it reads in a sense. It's very imaginative, and it does confront this kind of just the oddity of existence, I suppose, and of this body, this meat suit that we're in, and how it kind of has to confront the mind, and it can't be separated from it, and all that type of thing. And I always seem to remember this bit where he's kind of looking at this tree. I know this sounds super exciting, but he's kind of like trying to look at the mechanism of a tree, and he's trying to almost see through it in a sense where he could see its inner workings, and he's just like totally taken aback almost by this strangeness of it all. So in a weird way, I suppose it's almost a bit cosmological or cosmological in in its depiction. It's not in a horror way, but it could kind of feel like it's getting under your skin a little bit, if you know what I mean. Hence the title, I suppose. Number 2, Nothing by Jan Teller. This is a young adult novel, actually, quite short, but it is about a group of kids, one of whom declares that there is no meaning at the kind of typical age where you do start questioning the actual reality of things. And so to try and find meaning, they sort of oddly vow to build a heap of meaning, which is ironical, I suppose, because it very much sounds like a pile of shit. But they, in order to actually fill the heap of meaning, to discover if there is any meaning in all of this, they have to put something in there that's very significant to them, that actually does have meaning. But it often is something that they don't really want to put in there. But it's like this weird cross between, are they trying to find meaning, or are they trying to embrace nihilism kind of thing? And the things they end up putting up into the heap aren't necessarily like inanimate objects or material goods. It can be metaphorical or symbolic significances in their lives. It's a really interesting little book, and it's more pleasurable to read than something like Nausea. And I would actually say it's quite a good intro book into it as well. I underrated, actually. I'm not sure how many people have heard of this one, but I enjoyed it a lot. I've only read it once, but I just thought it had this almost I don't want to say fairy tale-esqueness to it, but maybe in the way that it was told. It's simple, but it's like deceptively so. So there is actually more going on, underneath, between the lines and all of that kind of thing. And some of it actually does become quite, quietly devastating, actually, and is quite like, wow, I didn't think it was actually going to go that far with things. And as I mentioned in the intro, like, it sticks with you. I still think about it from time to time, but it's kind of the same with all these novels, I suppose. Moving on. Notes from Underground, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Of course, this is going to be in the list. Maybe it's a little bit higher than some of you might have expected. Maybe even what I expected. I've read it multiple times. Of course, it's a very canonical piece. And I'll say here that the reason it's 7th is Dostoevsky's intended manuscript had a lot of the Jesus stuff that his later novels all contained. So I would actually give credit to the editor who was like, fuck that. But there is a kind of irony within it, because this novel was actually written in reaction to the Enlightenment era, saying that you can't just abandon, religious type of thinking all in favor for science, because people themselves aren't rational beings. And so this was kind of like Dostoevsky's example of this. But the reason I say it's ironic is because when the Jesus stuff is all cut out, because the editor was probably a proponent of this Enlightenment era, it's kind of funny that in a roundabout way it still kind of proved itself, because, well, the Enlightenment era ultimately kind of failed. But yeah, it's a great piece. It's, again, not much of a plot one, but at the same time, I think it's fine. There's a little bit of it. The first half of it is mainly our unnamed narrator railing against society and pointing out the absurdity of, labeling ourselves with professions and things like that, like who wants to be defined by one thing and all of this type of thing. And he attacks the... He mentioned something about, what was actually happening in that era. So you might need to check a couple of footnotes here and there. But the second half then he takes our narrator and puts him in society, essentially. He goes to see some old friends who don't really like him, and he doesn't really like them. He makes a total buffoon of himself. It's oddly funny because he gets so irate over the most minuscule nothing things. So it kind of demonstrates how he's so absorbed in his own thoughts to the point where he's, mad, like, well, he's conscious of his consciousness, or however it puts it in the book. And it's like being forever in like an observer of your own observations. It's just in this locked kind of place. And then he sleeps with a prostitute called Lisa and starts railing to her about this, that, and the other. And it seems like he has romantic intentions with her, but then as soon as she reciprocates, he throws it back in her face, literally, and we get a sense of a rapprochement with them both. But then him being who he is, you just kind of know it's not going to happen, and then he's essentially demonstrating why he is how he is and what led him to get there. It's pretty damn grim, but it is pretty damn funny at the same time, and it's intense. I would say it's a little bit of a slog maybe at the beginning, but once you get over that, it's good. No Longer Human. I debated by Osamu Dazai. Yeah, I debated whether to put this one in, mainly because I do think it still crosses into literature, just the pure type. However, I would also add that Osamu Dazai was very much writing his final piece, his kind of swan song to existence itself, I would argue. Pretty sure it was his last novel. And yeah, the themes throughout, I mean, it is about a life led up until a certain point. Obviously, Osamu Dazai did successfully commit suicide, in the end, after a few failed attempts, some of which are included in the book, which actually involved another female or a girlfriend at the time, and she actually did die and he survived. And it was, that's all, it's all in there. It's pretty brutal. Though if I was to be critical of it or mocking, I'd kind of say it's like a Japanese Chad, hooking up with multiple women but because he's depressed, it doesn't really mean much to him. Which is somewhat harsh take, but he can be a little bit grating in his moany nature, I suppose. It's got that kind of classic, an everyman type who discovers this manuscript or notebook of our main guy Yozo, who is obviously Dazai, and we kind of get this setup of like there's something really odd about him and what he looked like as a child and all of this type of thing. And then when he starts reading his notebooks, he can kind of, that's when we dive into that world. It does also have identity kind of themes, I suppose, where Japan is kind of crossing over between its traditional values and taking on the new of the West. And so it's at a kind of limbo stage where there isn't really much national identity. And that obviously is very much in Yozo, because he doesn't feel like he's ever belonged at all. He doesn't even feel hunger, in a sense. Like he feels very split, and it takes on roles from a young age, like playing the clown, playing this, that, and the other. So where the existential comes in, I believe, is there. But yeah, I would say it's maybe the least so in this list. Boredom by, I'm forgetting his first name. I want to say Alberto, but that might just be a stereotype. Moravia is his surname, so we'll go with that. Yeah, this is actually one, because I was actually going to warn at the beginning, I don't think you should read these novels one after the other, by the way, unless you are of a certain disposition where you find it easy to handle. I'm all right with it, but I would probably start to feel a bit like weighed down by them because they are heavy. But where I'd make the exception is with the next three, mainly because there's some nice crossover going on with them. And it's oddly, I mean, it must have been inadvertent, maybe with this one, because I can't quite remember when it was published, but I'm pretty sure it came after the next two. But yeah, there is some pretty big crossover with them. And we basically are following this painter who has had some success and seems to be doing all right. And then he becomes besotted with this 17-year-old girl who he notices is with this other painter, like a kind of, almost like a rival, but he's someone a lot older. And he basically gets completely obsessed with this girl and is, I think some of it is actually some of the funniest stuff I've ever read, especially when they're involved with one another, but he's paranoid that this girl is seeing this actor behind his back. And so he starts stalking or hanging out outside her house, and he's like hiding in his car. And then he gets so obsessive, probably because he's in the state of like stress and delirium. But he's like, he starts to worry every time he like checks the time or puts down his drink or whatever, that he might have just somehow missed her because she could have been like outside and he's looked away. So his attention constantly has to be like on her, but he obviously, because he can't do that. And then that goes from, I think, there to like a cafe where he's like trying to do the same thing by following her without getting detected. And her character is very cold and indifferent and really just is along for the ride with the guys who show a lot of interest in her, and there is a lot of them because she is of a particular type. But yeah, it's in this list for me because not only does it have a lot more comedy than the others, depending on how you read it, but also boredom to me is a perfect description of existentialism in a lot of ways. There is a, and I think I heard this from Sam Vaknin originally, but it's like, why is it then whenever we become obsessed, like say you read or watch this video and then you go and read these books and you're like, wow, this these books are like, you know, really opening my eyes and making me see the world in different ways and blah, blah, blah. And you keep reading more, keep reading more. Eventually, at some point, you're going to become bored. And that's the same and true of any pastime. Or anything you do, you can't keep doing it over and over again, because the end result is always boredom. Why is it always boredom? Because boredom is as close to reality as we can ever really get. Watch Stone in Focus, or listen to it, but watch it as well, because for the video, it's like by Aphex Twin, and it's just a monkey staring out, doing nothing for 10 minutes, basically. But it's like, it's quite odd, and that's the kind of state I think you'll return to. Obviously, you don't stay in this state, but there is we have a weird relationship to boredom nowadays, because we're constantly trying to, you know, find distraction and whatnot, but it is very much worth considering how you feel during these times, because that is you closest to reality as you're going to be. Some would say God, but I think that's when you're actually at that moment where, because really this existence is nothing, you know, like the title of the other one. It's forever in flux. It never really has a solid state, despite how it may look and feel and how you sense it. So anyway, let's get back to the list. Yeah, so you go from boredom, and then I would tackle probably The Tunnel by Ernesto Sabato. So that is number 5, I believe. Again, yeah, we have a painter, but this painter is in prison because he's murdered the woman that he was also very much besotted with, to the point it actually led him to kill her. So I think that, you know, if you go from boredom to that one, it's quite a nice overlap where you're seeing what could have been the end of boredom, and then seeing it from a similar mind. Although I do think the narrator in The Tunnel is probably the most erratic of all of them in this list. Actually, he's a character, all right. He's exceedingly narcissistic, and also just he's just on edge a lot. Like there's something unhinged about him, and yet he kind of comes across as like, you kind of go, yeah, I can see what he means by that, and then you're kind of like, wait a minute. You start to question your own like viewpoint of him as it goes on. And again, the woman he's very much infatuated with kind of gives no real indication of how much interest she has in him, but yet she goes along with it at the same time, and you're kind of thinking, are we getting a genuine depiction of her, or is he leaving some things out? Is he just unreliable in that regard? And yeah, we just but we also, you know, clearly we know that he will murder her, and so it's the journey toward that. And I think the tie-in with the title and why it is called The Tunnel is, I love that. If you've never read it, I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's like, I think it's beautiful. And the fact that he's a painter, it just woes itself really, really nicely. It's a quick read as well. It's one of the shorter ones of this list. But yeah, I've often read it a few times now, and I probably need to wait a few more years to read it again. But The Tartar Steppe by Dino Buzzati. We are following a young man who is by the name of Giovanni Drogo, I believe, who is a soldier. He is going to, you know, show his support to his country of Italy. He's going to go up to the fort of, fortress of the Tartar Steppe to stand guard and do his duty, his due diligence and all of that kind of stuff. And so it kind of plays on the hero's journey trope. You know, he's excited, he wants to, you know, be patriotic and do his country proud. He wants to have purpose, obviously, as well. And so he takes this long, winding road kind of trip up to this place. As soon as he gets there, he's horrified because this place is all but a wasteland. There's only a handful of soldiers there, and there's just nothing but desert around them. That's it. And so he spends the majority of the his beginnings there just trying to think of a way of getting out. But then as time slowly starts to bleed, he realizes that he will be, well, he starts to become committed. Basically, he starts to then think like, oh, if I just stay a couple of years, I've done my bit, that's when I can leave. And then obviously the more he's thinking about this, the more we suddenly realize that the years are starting to really trickle along, and he has essentially been doing his job as a soldier for way longer than he anticipated, up until the point where whenever he goes back to his origins, the village he comes from, even the woman that he used to see, who he thought he was going to end up marrying, he feels more of a stranger there than he does when he's at the Tartar steppe. And this is all in some vainglorious anticipation of the enemy arriving. Like, he thinks as long as they turn up at some point and he gets to fight the battle he's been waiting for, in some weird perverted type of way, it would have been worth it. And this novel ends in possibly one of the most brutal fashions I've ever seen or read. Like, it's heartbreaking for the guy, and for you reading, you're just like, really? You're gonna do him that dirty? Like, it's but then obviously the way you relate to it is just, I suppose it gives you a bit of a fear, like, but it's also just life. You know, you don't know if the decisions and paths you go down, where they're going to lead you. And I suppose in a weird way, you could see it as somewhat encouraging, maybe, in terms of that if you wait around too long, maybe what you're looking for will never happen, you know? But at the same time, even if you do it, it's no guarantee of anything happening either. So it's a bit, yeah. I actually view it as the ultimate anti-hero or anti-hero's journey. Like it, and if you were a fan of, say, Blade Runner 2049, I think you would really like the Tartar steppe as well, because it is, you know, it's like the character of Drogo thinks he's the main character, but then, like many of us realize, it's just we're not, basically. And yeah, even though the realization is a bit cold, the beauty of the prose is, I think, what carries it quite a bit. But also that kind of, I suppose, courage of the novel not to be something that's trying to depict anything in glory. I don't think it's not an anti-war novel or anything like that, or an anti-existence one. It's just very much in reality, the boredom of it. Number 3, the Metamorphosis. Again, this is another one that I'm not sure if I would even include it too much as an existential piece, because I think it's like the best novella ever written, to be honest. I think it's a masterpiece of literature, but there's definitely existential themes in it. Slightly surreal, supernatural, if you will, and absurd. It's funnier than I think people give it credit for as well, but I guess that might depend on how you read it. But the absurdity kind of comes in when Gregor Samsa wakes up one day to find that he is transformed into a gigantic bug, basically. I think it's debatable what type of bug it is, but in the original German, the wording is something, it's like a word that kind of translates as less than vermin. So he's actually transformed into something more disgusting than vermin itself. And we just call it a beetle because I don't think we have a description like that. But again, it doesn't really matter what type of fucking bug it is, to be honest. It's much more about him, obviously, and it is the identity he has with himself. He just thinks about going to work, like he's still in his human mind kind of thing. And there is a lot of humor to be found in that, and that humor ends up becoming the tragedy. I suppose the theory, or what is it, kind of saying that behind humor there always lies sadness. I think, yeah, that's certainly the case with this. And because Gregor Samsa lives with his family, they all don't really know what to make of what's happening. His boss even turns up at the beginning, and then when they see him, it's almost like, due to it being so unbelievable, they just don't know, and they kind of run off. So they don't really know. I mean, his family does stick around, but what's more tragic for Samsa is that he always thought that they relied on him because of, so he, even though he felt like a rat in the rat race, because he was just, you know, getting up, going to work, coming back, doing the same, all for the financial prospects of his family, who didn't really appreciate him that much. They all end up better off because they take more agency and they start to do things for themselves and all of this type of stuff. And he has to watch all of this, or at least become aware of it. And yeah, I don't know. I think it has a mixture of everything from the tragic to the comical to the beautiful overall. Like it and the reason I think it's a masterpiece as well is the ambiguity of it, the way you can read through it and like extrapolate so many different meanings and nuances, and just, yeah, I think the reason Kafka struggled to write novels as well is because his ideas were very dense. But I think here he truly got the balance right. Like it is a masterpiece, and it does have existential themes, so I can stick it in this list. Number 2, this is also part of the trifecta, Albert Camus' The Stranger. I think a number of you would have probably thought I would have this number 1, and maybe I'm just, yeah, not putting it as number 1. I don't even know why, really. Probably because I've talked about this novel a lot. Don't really need to add too much to it. It's probably the most famous of the kind of existential philosophical novels. But it is, yeah, it's also a, you know, masterpiece, I'd say, overall. Like it's probably as close to perfection as a novel can really get, especially one that is exploring the themes that it does. I think Camus could have just not written anything else after this. He oddly wrote The Myth of Sisyphus, but the themes and symbolisms in that are perfectly conveyed within The Stranger, so I don't really get what his intention was there. It's like, yeah, we got that in the fiction piece, mate. But, yeah. We're in the mind of Meursault, whose mother's just died, and he really doesn't know what to think about it. He doesn't even know what day it was. Like, he's very much in this kind of like weird state where you kind of start wondering what type of person he is. Is he, you know, is there some weird way he looks at the world? Is he autistic? Is he psychopathic? Is he, I don't know, is he just nondescript in some sense or fashion? Like, we're not sure. And I think the fascination that lies within it is just how he reacts to certain things. And it's basically a man who just refuses to conform to society's expectations. But when he goes against those expectations, he has to confront the consequences. And through doing that, that is when he actually becomes human, basically, by the end of it all. So, yeah, I mean, he has this girlfriend who suggests that they get married, and he's like, meh, why? What's the point in doing that? We couldn't, doesn't really make a difference. there's a lot of this type of way of relating to the world. Gets an offer for another job. He's like, yeah, I could go to Paris and, you know, move my life there, start something new. But again, what's the point? Like, I don't really see what difference it's going to make. And so as he's shitting all over, you know, society in this regard and what people would normally be quite excited about, he's just forever kind of questioning and pointing out the absurdity and pointlessness of it all, you know. It's not but it's though it's a little bit, that might make it sound like it's really depressing. I don't think it is. I actually think it's endlessly fascinating, and the way, and it has more of a plot than a number of the other ones on this list, but yeah, very nicely balanced. And then obviously he starts to get involved with people who are a lot more dangerous, and that leads him into killing an Arab, basically. And then he's standing on trial and he's having to try and defend himself. And because of the things that he'd done at the beginning, it all starts getting pointed out at the court to make him seem, you know, like a true monster and all this type of stuff. And yeah, it's not only like an essential existential piece, it's just essential in general. Like, you should read this book, as you should number one, which is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. Relatively kind of new. It's been re-released, this, and I read it on the book club. I don't know how far back now, but I was pretty blown away by this one, and I'm putting it on as number one mainly because I feel like the novel's getting a little bit misunderstood in terms of its genre. Like, I just don't really understand why people aren't, you know, calling a spade a spade. This is existential fiction. Like, yes, there's a potentially sci-fi backdrop or a dystopian genre, but it's very much existential. We're in the head of this girl who lives in a cage, essentially, or it's a prison that is guarded by a group of only men, and there's only women alongside her inside the prison. But she's also the only child. I can't remember her exact age at the beginning, but we're introduced to it at its latter stages when she's an older woman. And then so when it comes back, we start to basically live in the world that she's in and try to figure out what's going on in it. Some people might read it thinking it's going to go one way or another, thinking they're going to get answers, but I think the novel does, in fairness to it, you know, I don't think it really indicates that it's going to, really, at any point. So they go from being inside these cages, they don't know why they're in the cages, and obviously none of the other women do too either, but they did used to live in a world that you and I would recognise. But at some point, and through some mysterious event that they never really find out why it happens, the guards all disappear, and it's only through dumb luck that they can get out of the cage, because I think one of them was opening the door at the time and left it. So the women get to actually go out into the world, and the world that they go onto is just this barren wasteland where there's barely any, you know, nature or foliage. There's no it's just I think it's kind of desert like, but I think there's roads, and so you kind of assume it would be Earth. It could be somewhere else, fine, you know. So this is where the kind of sci-fi shtick gets or comes from. But to me, that's like saying Waiting for Godot is sci-fi, you know, like it's in some future where two people are walking around like this desolate area, and it's like, but no, clearly this novel is existential. I mean, even at the beginning, and the main character's talking, and she's kind of reading through books that she's discovered, and she's kind of pointing out how people see the world in a really odd way. Like, the author is explaining why they are writing what the point of what they were writing is, and this woman, obviously in the time that she lives in, is kind of like finds that really perplexing, because it's like, why do you need to give an explanation? you know, and stuff like that. Surely, like, it's worth doing anyway. And I would be able to word that better if I could remember, but yeah, it's kind of like, I suppose what it's doing is, I think, very cleverly pointing out a sort of absurdity of writing itself, because it's almost like the author having a bit of fun with you, but it is also, again, like, in its duplicitousness or duplicity, pointing out that obviously different eras will be programmed in the minds of its inhabitants. So you will be we could look back on the, you know, some of the things that people did back in the 50s, back in the 1600s, whatever, and you're just kind of like, why was that normal? Like, you know, that kind of thing. Or why did they, you know, what was the belief there? And yet, because everyone at that time believed it, it was just normal. But again, there's the passage of time in the novel also passes similarly to the Tartar Steppe, I would say. The girl at some point learns what time is and starts to count inside her head, and she does it so frequently and so often that at some point she does know when an hour has passed, because she can kind of, she senses it in the body, kind of thing. It's like she just knows the passage of time, and that cleverly starts to spread out when they get out of the prison, because they come up and they're on a desolate land, and then it's all about survival essentially, and then what they come across are other prisons that are identical to them, and then they realize that the women inside these prisons weren't so lucky as them, because they basically all starved to death inside it. She does come across one man at some point, or maybe obviously at the beginning there's alive men, but once they disappear, I think that's the last time she has any contact with men. So she doesn't know what it is to be sexual, really, or what it is even to desire in that regard. And I think it's endlessly fascinating. I mean, I think there's some who might claim this, that, and the other about, oh, but it makes these homophobic, you know, standpoints and stuff, but I don't think it does at all. I think it's much more about, you know, what another observation was like how some of the women, or I think even the protagonist herself, she never really ovulates or anything, because it's like, there's no reason to, you know, it doesn't make sense. And then that makes you start to question, well, what are you then as an animal? That kind of thing. It's just a bit like, do you just adapt that much to your environment? And then what does that do to you mentally? You know, things like that. And I think it's, yeah, a really, really good piece. And I will also give credit to the publisher who redid it and called it by a different name. It wasn't originally called I Who Have Never Known Men. It was called something else related. I'd have to look it up because I can't remember it in French, but I think the author was Belgian. I'm pretty sure it was written in French originally. I suppose it could have been Flemish, but yeah, if that kind of, I mean, if any existential, if you have any leanings that way, I think, yes, quite a few of the books in this will be of intrigue, but I definitely would, I'd like to know if people would counter my argument here, because I don't see it as anything other than existential, really. Yes, there's elements of the other things, but it's weird because I think people, if they went into this book thinking it's sci-fi, they're going to be pretty disappointed, because, you know, sci-fi normally explains the things that is going on. This novel doesn't explain anything, which is why it's much more like our existence than anything else, in terms of, like, obviously purpose, meaning, significance, what it even is. The era you live in as well will define how you look out into the world and all that type of stuff. But yeah, just to close the vid, because this is getting on a little bit longer than I intended. Hell, there's a book called Hell. I might try, I think his name's Barboose, something like that. There is another book by Colin Wilson called The Outsider. You can find a few others, like Hermann Hesse would be in there. Steppenwolf would probably be considered existential. Hell, obviously, is another one. That's just that one's kind of weird because the guy's like looking through a kind of gap in an apartment, and he's just watching as people are living their lives going through. It's kind of it's a little bit voyeuristic, but it's not just in a perverted way. It's much more he's actually just kind of observing how other people are and things like that. Not the most accessible one, I didn't find it was a joy to read, but it was intriguing. The Woman in the Dunes, that's another one I covered in the book club. That definitely has existential notions to it, and maybe a little bit more plot than some of them on here. And that's about it, I would say. Thanks very much for watching. Let me know if you have any existential novels that you'd include on your list. And I'll see you soon.